Wonderful. All right. Well, look, we might make a start, everybody, and as other people arrive, I will let them in. Thank you for coming along to today's webinar. Very, very excited to have a special guest join us today to tell us a little bit about a really exciting report and project led by Australia reMADE. To begin today's webinar, I would like to welcome everybody and also acknowledge the various countries upon which we are all meeting. I'm here on Wurundjeri country in Melbourne or Naarm and enjoying a beautiful sunny day. We recognise that the traditional owners and custodians of the lands upon which we all meet and live, and we pay our respects to elders past and present. We recognise that sovereignty was never ceded and that this land always was and always will be Aboriginal land. We also recognise the unique role of Maori and embrace the Treaty of Waitangi, New Zealand's foundation document, which confirms Maori as the first people of Aotearoa. It recognises that they have absolute authority or sovereignty over their lands, resources and treasured possessions, while embracing the three guiding principles of the Te Diriti: partnership, participation and protection. And what a wonderful way to acknowledge that treaty. For those of you that might be new today, we welcome you to the Australasian Women in Emergencies Network. We promote, support and recognise women in the emergency management and disaster resilience sector, and we have more than 2,000 members across Australia, New Zealand and the Pacific. We provide a whole range of benefits to our members and all of them are free. I'd like to remind anyone that we've got our AGM coming up. If you'd like to come along and attend that, please check your newsletters or contact me and I can make sure we provide you with the details. I'm very excited to introduce to you Dr. Millie Rooney. Millie is a social scientist, researcher and champion of engaged citizenry and politics, and Millie is based in Nipaluna or Hobart in Tasmania. She's also the Executive Director of Australia reMADE. Millie, I'm going to get you to tell us a bit more about Australia reMADE and what you do, and then to perhaps provide us with your presentation on care through disaster. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, and thanks everybody for having me here. I don't know what the usual protocol is with videos, but I would love it if some of you would turn your videos on so that I can see who I'm speaking to. And if you'd like to put in the chat, it's a really nice small group, which is exactly what I feel like today. So this is perfect. If you want to put in the chat your connection, like why you're here, whether you have a role in government or you're a citizen with a personal interest, just that would be really helpful for me to get a flavour of that. I'm here on Moonina country in Lutruwita, Tasmania. The beautiful Kununyi mountain is just through the wall there. There's a lot of bush running down to where I live, so I'm quite conscious about bushfire disaster and the risk of that. And the other thing that often doesn't get mentioned in my bio is I'm a carer, and I always put that as a really key part of who I am, a carer for my family and for my community, and I think this place as much as we can. I mean, Australia reMADE is an organisation that came about really to do two things initially, which was to think about who we could be as a country, where we want to go, what we want to do, and really push the boundaries of possibility. And to also understand, like, what are the structural issues that are stopping us from going there? So what's our shared vision, what unites us, and what has to shift, not just at the individual level, but at the kind of infrastructure level of the social and physical infrastructure. Now, I'm just going to share my screen when I remember how. Okay, that should be, you should be able to see that now. Is that correct? Can you see that?
Yes, I'm assuming, yes, there it is. That's great. Yeah, perfect.
Hide the chat. It's like I'm hiding out in an unusual room with a small screen, so fiddling all the things. So I thought I'd give you a little bit of a intro to this project and talk you through it. And because there's a small group, please do feel free to jump in if you've got a question. I can't see you all, so just come off mute maybe and raise your hand if it's important at the time, and there will be room for questions at the end. I also wanted to acknowledge that Women's Health Goulburn North East was part of funding this project. We worked in partnership with them. Probably many of you on the call were involved in some of the conversations, and again, recognizing that all of you in this network have a real wealth of knowledge and are experts in this space. I am not an expert in disaster. None of us at Australia reMADE are, but what we are really good at is listening, synthesizing, building frameworks, pushing possibility. And what I hope this work is I hope it's something in service of what you are already doing. And I hope that it pushes out space for you to do what you want to do well, to the degree you want to do it. The other thing I just need to note is that I wasn't the lead on this project, and that Lily Spencer and Rachel Hay took the lead. I was involved, but they really led it, and they are off doing other fabulous things, but not with Australia reMADE anymore. So if you have questions that I can't immediately answer off the top of my head, I can find them for you, but I may not be able to respond super quickly. And so much of this work really comes in some ways from the idea, I'm sure you're all familiar with Rebecca Solnit's book, A Paradise Built in Hell. But really a lot of the very simple nature of the work we've done here with the Care Through Disaster is to say, well, actually building the paradise first reduces the risks of having to go through hell. And so what does that look like, and how do we do that? The background to the project is that in 2020, so we'd had the big bushfires on the east coast of Australia, 2019, 2020, pandemic hit, and we really noticed people around the country were kind of saying, like, why do we do what we do? Like, why is it a trade-off between economics and health? How does this work? Why are we making the decisions we make as a country? And so we went out, as we always do, to a very wide range of people across the country, different politics, geographic locations, socioeconomic backgrounds, and said to people, well, what is it that you need for you and your community, and who should provide it? And we were asking about the idea of the public good, what drives us? And it won't surprise you that we heard very, very quickly, we need housing, healthcare, jobs, education, the internet, and access to nature. Now, some of this was right in the middle of the lockdown, so the internet and nature were like very high priorities. But what was fascinating about that was, so in the hundreds of conversations I ran, that would happen in the first 5 minutes, and then the rest of the conversation would be really focused on people saying things like, I want a place where the coffee is free. I want to be able to belong without having to fit in. This really strong wanting to be connected and participate. And we boiled that down into the 3 C's of public good, which was people want to care and be cared for. So both of those things. People want to connect to people and place, and they want to contribute locally and nationally. And so that's the framework that we do most of our work around now, these 3 C's, and how we focus the public good on that. And then more specifically in the disaster context, Women's Health Goulburn North East approached us and said, we're doing a lot around gender and disaster. What happens if we look at disaster through the lens of care? What does that show us? And so that's where this project came from, was like, well, what does it look like if we start to think about the before, during, and after disaster through a lens of care? And what is it that people and communities need to be cared for during disaster? So the first phase of the project was asking lots of different people, particularly in regional Victoria, about this, and experts, lived experience experts, people working in policy, people on the front lines. And just as a quick aside, one of the things that was fascinating in the gender divide is, while there's lots of women doing the frontline firefighting work, the men who we talked to often tended to say, oh, no, I don't do care work in emergencies, which was just a fascinating insight of like, I'm pretty confident putting out the fire is an extreme act of care. So kind of even thinking about how we talk about this stuff is really gendered and interesting. And so what we heard very simply from that work, that what it looks like or feels like for people to be cared for through disaster is that they need to be seen by each other and by any kind of external powers or authorities. And that being seen is recognizing local expertise, knowing the neighbors. You'll all be really aware that if you've got strong connections in your community, you can better respond in that moment. You know who needs care, you know who might need a car ride, you know who isn't accounted for. One of the experiences we heard about was a woman in a family violence situation in the middle of an emergency. And because she was known by others in the community, particularly someone who was running the neighbourhood house, the woman running the neighbourhood house knew who was safe and who wasn't for that woman in that domestic violence situation. So just that importance of being seen and noticed. The second one was people need to be safe. That's a no-brainer, obviously, if there's a fire or flood, but safety extended beyond, being physically safe. It was also about, is it safe to go to, an emergency shelter? Is it somewhere people are familiar with? If people have been there before, they're more likely to go again. We heard examples of people, who maybe were afraid to go to a church because of its history of homophobia, and so not feeling physically safe there, all of those things. And very strongly on that one, actually, as well, was people just saying government needs to act on climate change. You want to keep us safe, you need to act on that. So there's a very strong story there. And then supported lots of communities and people we heard from, have great things that need doing, but they need support. They need the financial support, they need the information. So that was the kind of main themes coming out of the first piece of work that we did. So there's 2 reports, and I encourage you to have a look at that one. That's really the background, the scene setting. And really what that one was kind of asking and pushing is like, what is if we're agreeing that people need to be safe, seen and supported, and that connected communities with really strong social ties and locally based trust in their infrastructure, what is the infrastructure that's missing there, and how do we boost and enable that? And questions that I have that run through all of this that I think we need to be asking from this work are we listening to people, and whose voices are we missing? Are the policies or programs we're implementing or pushing, are they uniting us or dividing us? I'll talk a bit more about that later, but what I mean there is, in the aftermath of a bushfire, there's a competitiveness for recovery grants. What is that doing? Is that laying the groundwork for a community that's united and can face the next disaster? Or does that lay the groundwork for cracks that are then going to be shattered when the next flood comes through? So asking that question about, are we all in or are we dividing? Insurance is another example there. And are we valorising community but failing to support it? And I'm sure there's experts here who know more about this than I do, but we heard in the Northern Rivers, there's this real valorising of what the community did and pulled together and continues to, but there's no material or not enough material support for that, not just in the moment, but before, during and after. So it's about the care work at its heart for me is about saying, we have an approach to disaster that is really a just-in-time approach and very much around efficiency. And first of all, there is nothing wrong with efficiency in a disaster, that is really, really important. The just-in-time stuff, we heard stories of people not having safety masks or fire trucks that worked, so there's so much more resourcing that you all needs to go in that. And I just want to really affirm that that's so important. What this work does, though, is say, on its own, that doesn't get us as far as we could go. That actually we know that strongly connected communities are much more likely, a much better place to survive in the moment and to recover. But because we have this efficiency approach, we're not thinking in that long-term scale of laying the groundwork 3 years before the emergency occurs and immediately after. So kind of trying to think longer term there. It's easier to fund fire trucks and cleanups than invest in good community infrastructure. That actually makes life good right now. And I think that's part of the message is the things that will keep us safe are the things that give us good lives right here, right now. And so the time frame is really important, and resourcing and valuing the relational work that exists. I don't ever want anyone to think that we don't see that this care exists. It's just not validated or supported. So how do we push together a resourcing and validation, a legitimizing of an infrastructure that allows for this relational approach. So report one is a lot of the kind of background on that. And then the second report is kind of much more steps through from the citizen through to the state. Like if you're in any of these positions, what are some immediate practical things that we think you could do to kind of get the ball rolling on embedding this stuff? And I'm going to skim through them quite quickly because I think a discussion is probably more helpful. But I just want to note that they layer up. So the things that I will say about the citizen have to be supported by the federal government. So none of this can exist on its own. It's not a like, oh, just do this. It's like all of these things are needed to layer up. So let me move the chat out of the way. As I was saying, the report is about how do we have a collective approach. It expands our idea of disaster infrastructure to be less transactional and more about engagement. It forces us to think in more innovative ways. And it really says, how do we harness all the institutions we have to focus on the public good? If I can click through. Great. So I know most.
Sorry to interrupt, Millie. We're still on the home. Oh no, here we are.
I think it's just a little bit slow.
A bit slow. Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So recommendations for citizens. I'll kind of whiz through this one because I'm fairly confident most of you have more expansive roles than just a citizen in that moment of disaster. But it's interesting that we are very often given our response to disaster as something we have to do. You know, you have to be prepared for 72 hours. I mean, great, I'm not disagreeing with that at all, but it's very, get your bag ready, get all this ready. How's your individual response? It's less common in our work that we heard to see that preparation as being about how do you participate in a collective response, a collective preparation. And, some of that is obviously shared, getting connected to your neighbours, etc. So they really quickly, the key things was get prepared. The number one the citizen person can do is be prepared for the 72 hours, have everything ready. Build the relationships and the capacity, get together with other people, play rugby, go knitting, go to the library story time, that is disaster preparation. And I think we often segment that out. And don't be afraid to talk about it. And then build and maintain ways of keeping in touch, through your local WhatsApp groups, etc. They're in the report for anyone who wants details. There's heaps of examples of where you go for this information and much more detail, but I'll just give you the high level stuff. And I think I've said this, but I think particularly for women, we get undermined when we have a coffee with a neighbour or, go to the women's group or, whatever it is. And just being really confident and standing our ground that the coffee, the social engagements of our communities are not wasted time here and need supporting. Oh yeah, and thank you whoever put that Red Cross link in, that's really helpful. And in my, just as an example, I'm in South Hobart. We've got a lot of bush nearby. It's going to be a bad fire season, and there's a local resilience group that has been getting people together to do bush dances. We've got a resilient fair coming up this weekend where there's going to be a mix of the fire service with their how prepared are you, and games for kids and get to know your neighbours. So it's really trying to lay that groundwork and infrastructure so that we can respond together when, not if, when we get a big fire. Community organisations, and I should have mentioned this second report built on the first, and there were, Red Cross will be there, great. This second report, Lily went out and talked to a lot of people in community organisations, government, so it's layered up and built on talking to those people. We heard a lot of people say to us that community organisations feel like they're shifting more from kind of the doers of deeds and broadcasters of information to becoming much more about enabling communities to do the work that they want to do. And that's not about like just walking away, but changing that relationship. And I think that takes time to relearn a new way of operating, and takes time to be funded to operate in that way. So the lessons we heard from people here is, do education by conversation, not just broadcast. So those really actually sitting down and getting it very local and place-based conversations. Learning to listen. That was something that I come across in every piece of work that I do, is people saying no one is listening, they're consulting but not listening. We want our expertise to be recognised. And I think there are a few different ways that played out in some recent disasters where locals felt that, we know how the fire burns here and no one is listening to us, that it is going to escape up this gully or whatever it was. And again, accepting that this takes time and resourcing. And I think part of what this framework is for is to validate that and to give people, some written form to push when that resourcing is needed. It's that paradox of the kind of deep, slow work of relational organizing is really hard to do in a crisis. And that's why we need to be thinking in that long term, laying that groundwork. And really having confidence in how we measure that or how we can't measure that. It's really easy to measure clicks. It's not easy to measure the depth of relationships that you have, or it takes more resources. Getting to know the community in different ways. Who's at risk of homelessness? Who's a tourist? What are the key languages? Where are the informal networks? Again, this is something that I'm imagining most people on this call have a really intimate understanding of, and this is about putting it in a framework to give you that power. And something that we try really hard at Australia reMADE, and we heard a lot in the feedback, is like making it joyful where possible, because this is really scary stuff. And I was saying before, people get very confronted when I talk about the risk in my household. And I say, I'm preparing floaty bags in case we end up in the river in a fire. But that's why the bush dances, the connecting, give people something to hold on to, rather than just that fear and panic. So building that fun and really scaffolding that. Local government, we heard, is equally grappling with when do we lead, when do we follow, and that kind of real tension, and how difficult it is for local government to get money for this care work. It's a similar way prevention is really hard to get money for. It's just kind of, how do you measure it? Who owns it? How do you resource it? We also heard that budgets, capacity, insurance, like oodles of insurance, are real structural barriers to local government doing what they want to do. And this is where it layers up again. Well, we actually need changes in how the federal government engages with this stuff, how the funding flows, etc. And acknowledging that, of course, local councils can't do everything. They've got the rates, rubbish and roads as that thing, but people are more and more seeing council as an interface between community and the bureaucracy. And that's a really useful opportunity there. So the recommendations we got from people were, again, that investing in connection. And so that's about having spaces, where the coffee is free, where people can turn up and they're welcomed without having to buy anything, without having to give anything, but the spaces that bring people together are really, really essential. I know, again, here locally for us, the local council provides funding for street parties and various things. And that even if we don't access the funding, it tells us it's okay and we'll be supported to do that. So like recognizing that that is disaster prevention or resilience. We've heard a lot about libraries being a really key place, but their opening hours are limited. And so making sure there are the parents groups, the youth groups, etc. Another really key thing local councils can do is that investing in safety, for both physical and mental health. And we heard some great examples of a high school gym in the Indigo Shire got funding from the education department to refurbish, and in that refurbishment thought about how it would be used as a community evacuation centre. There's, again, lots of examples in the report. And then this is a really interesting one around noticing when the community is ready. And this is where I wish I'd really been involved in these conversations. But we heard people saying sometimes you can't put this stuff on community, they're not ready. The flip side of that is we heard people say community has these great ideas, they're ready, they go to local government, and local government kind of panics and says, you know, it's too risky, we can't do this. And so knowing when the community is ready and kind of asking that, how does council say, oh yes, and yes, we can do this, and these are the things we have to do. And there were some great conversations around the risk aversion and always saying no to community projects, but what's the risk of saying no? What's the risk of not saying yes? And I can't remember who it was, and I'm sorry if you're on the call, but when we launched this, somebody was talking about they were working on this idea of risk, the risk of saying no. So if you're here, pipe up and let us know how that's going. And so that's about the risk care assessment, having that safe to fail framework. So where it's okay if there's failure as we experiment with community. And again, recognizing where those local leaders are, and going where their energy is there, because there's a lot of it, but people get really, really disheartened by the bureaucracy. And that applies to all levels of government. State government laying up. I mean, state government is interesting because it has a lot of the ownership over those formal institutions of care, you know, health, education, housing, etc. And so they have a very, you know, as you know, they have a very big role in that disaster prevention mitigation response. Just putting out their strong climate policies. We get that hammered into us again and again. And an important role for state government is, as well as the federal government, is not just responding, you know, to the market or responding to community, but actively getting in there and shaping it in a way that keeps people cared for. So shapers, not just fixers, and being really clear about purpose. That's something we talk a lot about at Australia reMADE, is like, why are we doing this? And, you know, for example, is the goal of our housing policy to make people wealthy? Is it a wealth creation thing? Or is it to ensure everybody is housed? So just like clarifying the purpose is a really powerful tool. Again, this is all obvious stuff, but addressing the underlying vulnerabilities. We know that any kind of disaster just exacerbates inequality. It brings to the fore any existing problems. And so, you know, cost of living, gender-based crisis, lack of resources for anyone who needs help. Like this is disaster preparation, you know, dealing with these things now. And we are not getting through this without many more disasters. This is the new world. And so why wouldn't we build something where there's an opportunity here, I think, to address a lot of these other vulnerabilities through that disaster lens and say, this is disaster prep. So yeah, and thinking about the wellbeing indicators as well, that you know, lots of states and territories now have wellbeing indicators, and really using those to think about how we respond to disaster. We also heard a lot that for lots of people on the ground, that state disaster response can feel really disjointed, like the crisis by crisis, grant by grant, and that so many good programs are actually ripe and ready to just be scaled. And so, you know, number one, just fund what's working. I mean, you all have that frustration, but yeah, big thumbs up. We don't have to invent new things. There's great stuff out there. And I hope that this work just helps build the funding behind that. Yeah, funding and scaling. And so also part of that is making sure we're getting together to celebrate where stuff is working, because there's some amazing examples there in the report of communities doing incredible work, government doing incredible work. It's really powerful stuff, and we need to get better at those kind of stories. And then again, as always, that trust and cohesion and agency through that recovery. And a lot of people in state government felt like they were getting in the way of communities. And that's a really, you know, bad sign on the bureaucracy that's there. And that we heard a lot of people were feeling like they had to be part of shaping the disaster response in a way that helped keep their boss's image clean. And I think that's a problem I'm seeing in other work that I'm doing, is the fear that is layered into the bureaucracy that's stopping us from doing good work. That said, state governments are getting better at listening, and there's great work going on. Yeah, so, and Sally here says, it's one thing to engage groups, but how do you then resource that work? And I've heard that in other work I'm doing on the public service, some really great consultation stuff going on, and then the failure to back up the findings and allow the communities to step in and do that work. So, again, just fund it, please. So state governments need to contribute resources, expertise, and information without taking over. And for anyone who is working in this space, I would just say I think it's really hard, and people are trying really hard to do it, and our systems are not set up for it. But there is a real appetite for communities to engage more and to be active, to offer themselves to this work. So it's really hard. We're in a really hard time for this. And then finally, for the federal government, people know that disasters are getting worse around the country. People are angry about it. That's pretty common what we're hearing. People want the federal government to be responding to climate change, and that real sense of like, it's one thing to face threats and deal with it. It's another thing to face threats where you feel like the people who have power are doing nothing. And so that sense of solidarity between, citizens on the ground and government is a really important piece for how we're going to get through this. We're one of the world's largest exporters of energy. We need to, there is very clear action we can take. And we can't obviously stop disaster. Actually, it's going to happen. But we can transform the context in which people experience it. And that's shifting from that market-based, individualized, isolated, privatized response to one that is collectively powered by a really positive relationship between the citizen and the state. And I think where we see, you only need to look to the US to see, the privatization of, insurance companies who are then requiring that you have a private fire service, that you're paying a private fire service if you want insurance. To imagine the kind of chaos and the inequality that comes from that. We're not there, but that's where we could go. And so we've been interested in, we kind of picked these recommendations for federal government of what does it look like to shift from private to public disaster insurance? And going back to that question I asked before about, is it dividing us or uniting us? And the insurance is one of those interesting things we don't really think about until we're struggling on the phone to get the insurance company to come to the party. But it's going to be increasingly a massive divide between the haves and the have-nots. The insurance industry, there's a parliamentary inquiry, that says it's a problem. And it's privatizing our response to a collective issue. And so it's also about the mindset that we're bringing to this. And it's increasingly unaffordable. So it's about, I think, 1 million Australians are currently under insurance stress. And by 2030, the Climate Council says 1 in 25 homes will be uninsurable. So the flow-on effects of like fragmentation and anger, I think, are really high here. So what would it look like to have a public insurance model that's maybe paid for by fossil fuel companies, that kind of thing, where we are actually all in this together. And one of the things we talk a lot about at Australia reMADE is a universal approach. Everybody means everybody, whether it's Gina Reinhardt or someone who's living in a caravan, everyone. We actually have to do this for everyone. The other thing we heard, interestingly, was a lot about the building the capacity of a citizen disaster relief response. And partly this came from conversations about, the Defence Force it's unsustainable for them to be responding. And we would argue that actually it adds to the militarisation of our society. And that's overall not a good thing. And I always imagine, if we had a perfect community where this was working well, imagine you work 3 days a week, paid work. In the other 2, maybe you like to go sketching, you're an artist, but you've also got capacity to learn to wield a chainsaw. And then when disaster strikes, you've got that extra buffer capacity to be part of the citizen response surge capacity. And thinking about how we free up that time for people. We heard so many stories of local fire services and SES saying, without people, there is no SES, and we don't have people. Everyone is too stressed financially, time-wise. So there's a real role here for federal government to back the capacity of citizens to do the work that they want to be doing. And also part of this was about how is there an infrastructure when someone turns up and says, I want to help, what can I do? How are their skills already known? How are they already embedded? And the final point for federal government is really zooming out to that. How do we harness government for the public good, for well-being, for people and planet? And, things that there's, again, it comes back to that market shaping, if we want to use the language of market, but how is government shaping a context that enables us to respond at all of those different levels that is positive socially, environmentally? And the Treasury has the Measuring What Matters Wellbeing strategy. There's a lot to be kind of looked into that about whether it's strong enough, but that's a potential place to push some of this stuff. And again, to take a disaster lens to and say, like, this is disaster prep and recovery. And I can't click. So, we've been thinking about, well, what would some transformative enablers be that the federal government could implement? And again, this is about how do we build the capacity for citizens to do the work they want to do? A 4-day standard work week, a universal basic income, public jobs for the public good. How do we set a context where people have the surge capacity to respond in a way that makes sense for their communities? And we know universal basic income, for example, is supported by most Australians. There's been some really interesting examples in the US where they've trialled it, and the money has been spent on, housing, keeping people safe. So there's models around this stuff that shows that it works. And I'm really interested in this if we think about care. So I'm a carer for my partner's chronically ill. He can't really leave the house. And I think about care. Care is not transactional. It is not something that you can very easily, box off, because we all have different care needs. So all of this work is about what is the infrastructure that carves out the time and the space and the legitimacy for us to trust each other at all the levels, all of these different levels of trust, to respond in the way that we need to be responding. So the best way I think of it is an interpretive dance. And so I've got to work on the comms on this, but what is the box that we can then move and love and care in that is very legitimate? So, there's all these details in the report. I won't talk you through it. It's what I've talked through, and I'm happy to share any of the notes. Encourage you to read the report. But I really think the key message is disaster is here. It is coming. We are going to be living through it. But as Rebecca Solnit says, disaster is a time when the rules go out the window, and there are so many rules I would like to throw out the window. And how about we use this disruption? How about we plan for this disruption? How about we build the world we want to live in? Because that is actually disaster preparedness, response and recovery all in one. And just to finally say, it's amazing getting to talk to people like yourselves in this space who are doing this work with so much care, under so much pressure where the care is squeezed out. And I just want to say we've seen it, and thank you. It's amazing and all power to you. And if we can help in any way, please sing out. So thank you.
Oh, wow. That was just amazing, Millie. I've got so many thoughts and ideas swirling around in my head. But I think with your closing comments there, that you're absolutely right. We're living in an era now of increasing risk of extreme weather and disasters and other disruptions. And, prior to that, over the past 50 years, we've lived in a period of relative peace, certainly here in Australia, and we're not used to it from a community point of view, from a societal point of view, from a cultural point of view. We're not really used to dealing with that level of disruption and the kinds of level of disruption that disasters bring. But with the increased disasters with climate change and other hazards, we are going to need to rethink the way we do things and even rethink the way that we live in day to day, as you've suggested with, well, let's shorten our work week so that we can free up the time to manage the kind of things that we're going to need to be managing, whether it's, supporting our friends and our families and our neighbours, or preparing our gutters, or being part of a local volunteer emergency services organisation, or whatever role that you want to play locally. Really, really fantastic. I've got a bunch of questions, but I would really like to open it up to our attendees to ask some questions. So please, look, we're only a small group now. We've lost a few people who've obviously headed off to other things, and very possibly the Australian Disaster Resilience Awards. But if you do have any questions, please just unmute yourselves and ask away. Don't be shy. All right, well, perhaps while everybody's thinking of a question, I've got a couple of things. There's a lot of work going on at the moment around social capital. And I know that Resilient Ready is doing some work around social infrastructure. And you talked earlier about the roles of places like libraries. And I know that Resilient Ready is doing some work looking to how to map some of these places so that you can look at a community and say, it has a high level of social infrastructure, or this community has a low level, and therefore we need to build, more playgrounds, more footy clubs, whatever it is that bring people together. What were some of the other social infrastructure things that you found brought people together?
Well, first of all, I would say it's interesting when we're looking for how we build that social infrastructure in communities. Is I always think of like, well, what is also, even if you have them, what's stopping people from accessing them? Is it, I'm all for all of us getting really involved in democracy, but are you looking after a kid so you can't go to the meeting? So, like, I think there's that, like, when we're thinking about building that enabling infrastructure, it's not just the parks or the spaces, it's the childcare, it's the free, like thinking about that. The time poverty is really problematic here. Things we heard were, shared art projects as offerings for people. I can't remember the location. Someone might remember it. It was in Regional Vic, and a gallery opened up a recovery. It was post-disaster. It was a gallery opened up an art exhibition, but a lot of the canvases were blank, and there was a QR code, and the community could then populate the gallery with their own art. So I think those kind of offerings for people, I found that it's not just the spaces, it's the facilitated invitation. Yeah. That we heard, and that
Absolutely.
community leadership to hold it.
Yeah, so inclusion and accessibility as well. Yeah, are just so important. Absolutely. Couldn't agree
And
more.
the invitation, I think that's the really important thing. Like, I recently, well, not recently, it was years ago, I ran a community event for Neighbourhood Day. I am very interested in community. And what I found was having someone, me, random person in the street, say, I'm going to run this event, you can all come. I had calls from people saying, can I bring my belly dancing troupe? And I was like, yeah, sure. And people kept asking, and all they needed was a central person who would say, yeah, cool idea. Like, I think having someone who will be that yes person, even if, I call people like that amateur yes people, which is what I am, I don't know how it works, but I'm going to do it and help other people say yes.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I think the other thing too is when we're thinking about disasters is that role of outreach. So actually going to those places where other people and other groups are meeting and actually, approaching them rather than that sort of invitation, come to us
Yeah.
thing. So there's because that's everybody's different and people, respond differently, introverts and extroverts in some ways,
And
I guess.
particularly if you don't want to think about disaster, I don't want to spend my Tuesday night being scared.
Exactly, exactly. The other thing that came across really strongly in your presentation, Millie, was the role of listening. Um, and the need in particular for all levels of government to take the time to listen more deeply. And I'm wondering if you can share some of, your insights and your organization's
Mm.
insights about how you listen and then how you translate that
Mm.
into something
Mm.
that's, practical and
Yeah.
inspiring. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting because another piece of work that I'm doing at the moment is around the public service and the role of the public service in serving the public good, which should be obvious, but actually no one we're not having that conversation. And a really strong theme is people just saying, we're not being heard. And actually, anytime anyone wants to consult, we just want to tell them to bugger off. And any consultation is damaging democracy rather than encouraging it. So it's like a really important piece. And to like the way we approach it, because I spend a lot of time listening to communities, is I'm always really clear about why I'm listening and what I'm going to do with what I've heard and what I can and cannot do. I always report back to that community with a, hey, these are the key things I've heard. Is that right? And in my case, I often try and write a blog, which is because my job is to synthesize. Individuals get lost. And I think building trust is about saying, I see you as an individual. The other thing that I think is really challenging for people like me is I hear things I don't agree with politically. In fact, I really strongly disagree with things that I hear. And having people who are skilled enough facilitators to step back and be like, okay, I've heard you. I'm here to listen because you're not me. And that willingness to be converted for a moment to someone that you are not, I think is really powerful. But none of that works if you cannot follow through on and if people think you can do something and you actually can't do it. And I'm hearing a lot about people just aren't trained. So none of it is like, I mean, occasionally I think people do it with, nasty intention, but most of the time people aren't trained and aren't resourced, because listening to the community, my schedule goes out the window every time. Like you just have to go at that pace. And so I think examples of where I have heard of communities being really well consulted and then government being like, oh yeah, we've heard that, but you can't be part of implementation. And so I think it's a resourcing issue that we have to fight for and validate. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, that's fantastic. I think, yes, some listening skills training might be a really fantastic thing, sort of delivered right throughout government. One of the other things you touched on was mental health and well-being. And to me, I think there's a real opportunity with the wellbeing framework and that sort of potential shift to a wellbeing budget, to think about how governments can start to incorporate the wellbeing of people and communities in everything they do. And that then also puts people at the centre of all of their decision making and their considerations around decision making. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, first of all, I think it's wild that we're suggesting like that we have to think about well-being as should be at the center of all of this. Like, what is the purpose of government if not to do that? And yet, the kind of neoliberal context we live in has made us question that the bureaucracy, the privatization of a lot of things, the outsourcing, the individualization. So it's again not to point fingers at any individual. It's a global thing. And I've lost track of the question that you just asked me.
That's okay.
I was too busy on my high horse.
Mental health and well-being.
Yeah, I mean, I think again, there's different ways to chop that up. There's the basic stuff about, we heard so many examples of people saying there was mental health support for our communities immediately after, but actually we need it 10 years after. Like, we still need this stuff. So I think there's the thinking about the longevity and weaving in, like, actually we all need mental health support. And so why do we have this sudden surge capacity the day after the disaster? We just need that in place. And then with the wellbeing frameworks, I don't know how many people have heard of the Welsh example, where they did this big listening activity in Wales where it was what the Wales we want. And I can't remember the population of Wales, but they had 10,000 people involved, which was a large proportion of Wales. And they had children, community groups, everyone participating. And they found this there were nine, I think, pillars to the Wales that people want. And then they ended up enshrining that in a piece of legislation. And then they had the Future Generations Commissioner. So she, she's got a legislated role. And what I think was so important about that process around well-being, and so there's well-being goals for Wales. And what was so powerful about that was the process of the conversation got people engaged and got people thinking and acting. And so again, the outcome of these well-being goals on their own is kind of, it's a bureaucratic piece of paper, but the buy-in and engagement and process of imagining was part of the power that it held. And so I think not developing this well-being mental health in isolation.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And because I can imagine it, the questions were probably quite open-ended and so allowed then for, as you say, imagination and for people's values to come through and their visions, whereas government consultation tends to be, we've got a thing
Yeah,
which we've already kind of decided on. What do you think about it? And then they may tinker around the edges, but it's not that sort of from the heart,
yeah,
and from the gut and from that lived experience. Here's
yeah,
what we really want. Yeah, yeah, that's really interesting. I'll have to look it up.
yeah. Send it
Yeah,
through. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, great.
Um, with regards to social capital, how do you see this work tying in with social capital, or do you know much about social capital?
I mean, I think really this is all about social capital and it's all about saying, how do we validate it? How many women have been told, oh, she's just gossiping over a coffee. Like actually gossip over a coffee is real work and it's pleasurable most of the time. But what happens when you have a cup of coffee? You're building social capital, which is like, oh yeah, I know that this person's having a baby. I know this person's going into hospital. This person's looking for a house. Those pathways we can activate at the drop of a hat, and you don't get them if you don't have the coffee or you don't, so I think this is all about saying and people are, not everyone wants a coffee. Some people want to go and learn to chainsaw or paint or, it can be activity based, but again, part of what really drives me with this stuff is how are we making space and freeing up time and capacity so people can do that work, which lay the foundation so that then when we need to come in with the efficiency response, it just.
It has been updated.
Ooh.
Oh, Sharon, sorry, we got to, we can hear you there.
Sorry, it should still be on mute.
That's okay.
It's fine.
Go ahead, Millie.
Oh, I just think that, in social, I sometimes shy away from social capital because it sounds transactional like financial capital, but really what it is saying is capacity to know your neighbors, to respond to that, to be able to call in a favor, to be able to offer a favor, to exist outside of that transactional system. It's a system of trust, and that is what we have to have.
And that's the way that people and communities work. We don't work in little silos. We're not just off doing one thing in a silo. We live with connections all around us, whether it's through work or hobbies or children or caring or whatever it is, knitting clubs and footy clubs and what have you. We're all about relationships and all about connections. We're not in
That's
silos.
right. And Rebecca Solnit, if anyone here hasn't read her Paradise Built in Hell, I just recommend you go and read it. But she talks about the joy that turns up after disaster, when neighbors get the barbecues in the street and say, this is what life should be. Yes, we're traumatized by this, but hang on, this is the purpose. And so what we're saying is, if we can help create spaces for that purpose to begin with, the disasters are going to be felt much less. That's yeah.
And that's why I think it's such a shame the politicization of climate change has been, really to our detriment. Because if I think back to something like, the world wars, which are pretty ancient now, but, our communities really banded together because there was a big existential threat over here. And, I mean, amidst the trauma of war,
Yeah,
of
of
course, but
course.
nonetheless came together to all work for the common good and work with one another. And climate change, we had that opportunity to respond like that, but instead it's been, fractured and it's gone all over the place, and we're in a much worse position now than we were 20, 30 or 40 years ago. And just on social capital, I'll just do a bit of a plug for those who are here. But my day job is with Australian Red Cross. I'm with the national policy team there, and we're about to release a report on the role of social capital in disasters. So do keep an eye out. It'll be on LinkedIn and in various things, and you can always contact me if you'd like to know more. Millie, we're just about out of time. I think I could sit and talk with you for at least another hour. I feel like we've just started to unpack your work, but really fascinating work. And what I can say is that you sound like you know what you're talking about when it comes to emergency management and disaster resilience. You have obviously really heard people, and that has come through, very strongly in your presentation today. And yes, there are a lot of experts here who are attending and who attended earlier, but certainly everything that you've said has really resonated and makes total sense. So congratulations on
Oh,
the
thank you.
amazing work. Yeah, really, really fantastic work. Thank you so much. Thank you to everybody for attending. We have recorded today's webinar, and I will share the link with everybody who registered, and yourself, Millie, so that of course you can promote that through your networks. Do come along to the AGM if that's something that will interest you. And of course, reach out to us at info@awenetwork.org.au if you have any queries about or any ideas for future presentations. We're always really keen to get ideas from our members. Millie, thank you again.
No worries. Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, and good afternoon.